their misguidance. And I created an organization called From Hate to Hope with the intent to educate anybody and everybody. I connected with politicians, advocates, policymakers, to basically create an awareness about that it's not that there needs to be room for people such as myself who identify beyond genders. I don't think genders are fixed, and I think we have that freedom right now in this day and age to create spaces for people like me, because because it's awesome, it's free. It's really creative to be have that freedom to express yourself in the way you want, not live in a box. So that's the background of it. But through that, I kind of think when I was assaulted, they kind of assaulted the right person. And at first, when I was assaulted, I was really upset that I was targeted because of someone else's ignorance. But then, in retrospect, and after all the personal self-discovery that I've gone through, I realized they really targeted the right person, because given the background of my politics within my family, so I guess politics is within my DNA, I was able to turn Hate to Hope into a way to push for policy changes for gender minorities, gender expression, and and two-spirited people as well. So I was really able to help a lot of people through Hate to Hope. And so for the last 4 years, I found myself advocating with politicians, organizations throughout Alberta, including I'm blank, I got really nervous. I find every time I talk about my story, I feel like it triggers me, so I need to get over it. Talking to organizations and conferences, youth conferences throughout Alberta, and students and youth, and collaborating with other advocates, basically for social change and to change the social fabric, locally, regionally, to include people who express themselves in different genders. And I also work with the Child and Youth Advocate, educating social workers on the next generation of people who are gonna. Oh, I got tongue-tied. I had it all planned out here, so I didn't think I was actually gonna get nervous. This isn't my first rodeo. But I think through my work, turning something negative into a positive has been really beneficial to me, because it opened up a lot of doors. I campaigned with my friend Catherine Swampy, both federally and provincially. And then I helped her get into politics for her local community. And I've worked with so many different politicians and from different backgrounds, different stripes, different political parties, as a nonpartisan, to advocate for gender minorities within Alberta, and basically to allow people such as myself to have that dignity and respect within organizations, and educate their employers what gender means, gender expression, and what kind of policies they have. And so that's been very rewarding, because I know a lot of people who are within, when I go and speak to an organization, a lot of people within that organization who identify usually come up and thank me that they feel better that the policies are being implemented, that the culture within that organization shifted from being hostile to more inclusive over a year. So I know that I was able to make a lot of change that way. And so I think a lot of my work right now too is a lot of media work as well. So I find it's awareness, because I think a lot of the issue is lack of awareness. It's like the ignorance. It's not like ignorance. It's just like people aren't aware of that there's different ways to see the world. There's different ways to express yourself within the world. There's different genders. There's the term two-spirited, where you have, which is a First Nation concept of you have your feminine side and your masculine side, and that exists within you, and it comes out this way. So that's really common within First Nation communities, but also within non-First Nation communities. within the transgender community. Sometimes when people are transitioning, they tend to be more male or female. But I think what we can do, I wrote down some policies that could really be effective in, from working with different organizations. I don't know why I'm so nervous. I feel like I don't want to let anybody down. I feel like when I come to conferences, I want to add value. And I'm really hoping that like something I say resonates with somebody. So some of the, so besides my story, my background and growing up with really supportive parents, I think without my mom and my father, I think I would have faltered, because I've noticed that within a lot of the LGBT community, a lot of them they lack that support, they don't have that supportive networks. So a lot of the times the organizations such as social services, because I speak to basically all social services in Alberta. At one time I spoke to them about how to make their workforce more inclusive, and then that resonates in being more inclusive with their clients. But a lot of LGBT people don't have those support networks. A lot of them end up being pushed out to the fringes of society if the organization does not support them. They end up being pushed out to the fringe and then homeless or having struggles. So I really think it's vital that organizations throughout Canada and Alberta create a culture of inclusiveness towards people who are transgender, two-spirited, and support them during their transition, because there's a lot of people who come out who are transgender. It's not like you just wake up and you're transgender. No, it's a process. It's up to 2 or 3 years, and then you have to work with that individual for 2 or 3 years as they're going through their self-doubt. They're changing their hormone therapy and all that kind of stuff. So I really think having supportive coworkers or senior management staff to really support those people and create those policies around that, it's vital. So some of the recommendations that I've come up with are policies that include a gender identity as a protection. This will prohibit discrimination against transgender employees, including gender identity and gender expression. And secondly is establish gender transition guidelines. I can't see my own writing, I have like chicken scratch. Guidelines and protocols and gender transitions create clearly stated responsibilities and expectations. Transition employees utilize senior management and demonstrate the organization's support of that employee as they're transitioning from female to male or male to female. And education and compliance provides information for training in corporations, education about gender identity and gender expression and diversity and equal employment opportunity and compliance and training. So basically bringing in people such as myself to come to the basics of what's gender, what's sex, what's gender expression, and what those acronyms are is a good way to start. Because I think that's a need. Most organizations don't have those. Do any of the people in here or organizations have brought in an advocate to kind of educate on gender, LGBT? Not yet.
Not in my office.
No. Okay. Cool.
No.
Yeah, IRCC just this past February.
Okay. Cool.
Recently has included the positive space training, and then we're developing a network of ambassadors or partners or allies within the community so that they have that. But that's like now.
Okay, so started.
They're doing like presentations in their individual meetings,
Cool.
team meetings, and it was very eye-opening, and we kind of are, at least in our office, trying to just identify simple things to make those positive actions towards inclusiveness. But yeah, very new. I don't think it's better, even though it's within our collective agreements. I'm pretty sure
It's just not very
action hasn't been taken.
Okay, so it's very new. So you can bring people in like me. I work for Correctional Services Canada. So I went to basically educated all of the correctional services officers throughout Alberta on gender identity and how to identify it. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, we, in Regina, my department, we've also included or started the Positive Space Ambassadors.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I think we've actually done 3 training sessions now, so I was a part of the second training session, and we just make sure in our workspace and our cubicles that we identify that we are Positive Space Ambassadors, and that we send information on what a Positive Space Ambassador does, so we can kind of help bridge the gap if somebody is going, like, transitioning or coming out or whatever the case may be, kind of help bridge that gap, and then find, be that support both internally in the workplace, and maybe externally with different organizations or places that they can go for information to kind of help in that process. So I just wanted to add to that.
Cool. So it sounds like it's starting. It's very new. Okay, perfect.
Very, very good.
And it came at the right time. I'm meant to be here.
So how are you, everyone? So my name is JAGRIT, and just before I begin my presentation, originally I come from India. I was an international student. I landed in Canada in 2015, January 1st. So my New Year Eve was just in air. It was funny, but it was a very struggling life. In 2015, I was living on donations a couple of times. I did do that. But somehow I've been managed to graduate in accounting degree, and I started with Canada Revenue Agency in 2016 as a co-op student, being an international student. So it's been a great ride for me, and I'll share some perspectives today about what I have done previously, and I'll just do that. So before I begin, my name is JAGRIT SINGH Bajwa, and one more click please. So the word "singh" in between means a lion or a tiger. So my name is very hard to pronounce. So what Canadians did is they found an easier way of pronouncing my name is called Jaguar. So they gave me a nickname. So it's pretty interesting, why Jaguar belongs to a cat family and it's belong to that lion and tiger families. So this is what diversities need. So why? Because my name is keeping me to my roots. So the nickname given to me gives me to my roots still, and I'm still feeling inclusive in the environment. So yeah, so that was just a little introduction on how I find that little effort from the idea of a collaboration. That you can call me Jaguar, but yes, why? Because my name has a word "sing" in it. So just that for an educational purpose. Yeah, so I'll just share a few experiences that I've had previously, and I was United Nations Youth Delegate in 2017 in Winter Youth Assembly. I was a top 16 finalist at the Social Venture Challenge by the Resolution Project. So what they do is they gather young leaders from around the world and they share the ideas. And many of the young leaders, they are belonging to some social entrepreneurship categories, and they work on various sustainable development goals. So there are 17 sustainable development goals, and I'll just touch on the next slide about it. I did mention that I am working for Canada Revenue Agency. I was a student who got bridged into the federal public service, and within my work tenure in CRA, I have been working as a new hire ambassador, student ambassador, and a social media representative at Young Professionals Network Committee. I assume you might know that committee. So a lot of my work is on smooth transitioning of young professionals when they get into federal public service itself. And I've been working with them as soon as I was hired. So I was pretty lucky, and I do maintain I'm one of the Twitter handlers of their social media account. And I also, this year, I found an organization, it's for-profit, we're social enterprise. It's called L Jaguar Sports Canada Inc. And so what we do is I support those cricket players or those sports persons who volunteer for 100 hours for other communities, not for their own community, but for other communities. So I recently sponsored a sports person in India, and so he was a 16-year-old guy. He spent 100 hours on grounds, maintenance work, making cricket pitches, and to let others develop their own skills. So this is how they contributed. Secondly, I would like to congratulate Joel. He's from the music family, and it's very interesting to have you here. And I also do music videos. So I have done some songs on women empowerment, human rights issues. So one of my songs, its name is Abused She. I did that like back when it is still very pre-amateurish, but I do sing that at various stages. But it's in Punjabi and Hindi, the language that are mostly spoken in India. So India has been going through a lot of issues relating to women empowerment, and there have been so much sensationalized cases about women, and recently there have been so many things happening. So I made that song just to make youth aware of what we are going through and what the future is looking like. So I do some of those songs which are based on social perspectives. I did a song for human rights issues. So there's a guy back home in India. His name is SINGH. So what he's doing, he's in hunger strike since January 2015. So the government is forcefully feeding him, but he doesn't want to eat himself because he's fighting for those prisoners who have passed who've been in jails and have passed their terms. So if someone was jailed for say 5 or 10 years, they are being kept into jails for 20 to 25 years or 30 years. So all of their lives have just been spent in India, and the government is just not listening to his effort. So I made a song on that, and I sang that on different stages. And recently I hosted a turban awareness event at Global Village at NATE. So what NATE does is every year there's a Global Village event, and I do perform and I do a turban awareness event that day. Especially this time it happened to be on the same day Alberta government came up with a new law that should Sikhs be allowed to not to wear helmets. So that's a pretty good discussion. It's very interesting. There are many pros and cons involved. Definitely, inherently, it has a risk. And so I did give a talk on the Ryan Jesperson show. He's a radio artist, I believe, and so he invited me over a radio call last week itself. So it was pretty interesting to share perspectives and what does turban mean to Sikh people, but definitely what's the balance between the risk that has been increased in past 30 years when those laws were exempted in the provinces of British Columbia and Manitoba. So there was 0.01% increase in the risk in the accidents. So there was just a balance that the lawmakers had to decide, but inherently it is not that safe to ride a bike. And yeah, so this was just a bit of my introduction. And so while I was a United Nations Youth Delegate, I came to know about Sustainable Development Goals. I had no idea what I've been doing previously and how my work is being connected to those Sustainable Development Goals. So what purpose that we are here today is about SDG 16. So what it says is promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So this is the purpose of the union here. We are here to prevent misuse of authority. We are here to make sure those rules and laws are made so that promote inclusiveness and workplace wellness. So there are three slogans there. That's been in the last 3 youth assemblies I've been hearing. So first one is action begins with youth. So it's youth who will determine how they are going to pursue about the future. Definitely, as a youth, we are also making sure that we are not leaving anyone behind, including visible minorities, including LGBTQ communities and women. And in the recent Youth Assembly, it was co-creating impact. It's like you have to build those collaborations and partnerships within your service areas, within your areas of expertise, so that those agreements and those partnerships can be brought up. So, and youth is considered to be a stakeholder in the decision-making process, because youth in the federal public service, they just don't have power. They are just sidelined. Management considers youth to be like their beginners, but I think youth is way more creative, way more diverse in their opinions, and they know how to use social media. So, next please. So, yes, so now what I'll discuss is how I've been working with BIPN Young Professionals Network Committee in my work, in my tenure in CRA. So I did a lot more things than this, but yeah, what I can share is I did get support from the management, and right from assistant director to everyone. But yeah, so I started a 1-minute Twitter video series. It's called #ForeverYoung, and the Twitter handle for the account for YPN is @YPN_YEG. So every month there's a video posted on workplace wellness and mental health issues. So that's how I relate my previous work to the innovative series that I started, because when I was at United Nations, I had proposed an idea where everyone can feel inclusive, how we can break stereotypes, how we can improve condition of women, and how we can prevent ourselves from bullying and cyberbullying. So those were the things that I wanted to keep in mind whenever I started doing some new work. So that was one of my works, and so I started that. Now it's being handled by someone else, but I've been the innovator for that Forever Young #series. Now every month, an employee, a manager, or assistant director speaks on a pre-assigned 1-minute topic. We just discusses about some mental health issues. Maybe it can be stress, maybe it can be fear, or something else. So, all of the federal public service employees are not on Twitter. They fear social media. There are a lot of things that we need to make sure that we are on a correct path. But at the same point, we can also educate them how we can move ahead, and how we can create those platforms which can generate either even informal communication. So I hosted an event, Twitter 101 session, where I invited employees and different team leaders, and like it was a tax service office wide event. And so the purpose is to open those channels of communication where youth can put their opinion. Otherwise, emails that come from commissioners or assistant commissioners or downstairs, not downstairs but downwards, yeah, those are just not interesting enough. Youth needs involvement, youth needs sense of community, you need to be heard. And recently, in last year also, I did a talk show with, so the picture, it's not that clear, I'm sorry about it, but I was questioning with one of my colleagues to the director of that tax service office at the time. His name is Jeff Mills. So we did a student event, and students were able to ask questions directly to the management. So there are no open platforms. I didn't see there are any open platforms, maybe in the unions. So if those open platforms, those informal channels of communication, if they can be brought up, I think there will be more diversity of opinions, there will be more information when the decisions will be made, and this is how youth can feel heard. And so I did put up this topic in front of my committee itself. They did give me some ideas, and I just put them together. So in the unions itself, I don't believe, in the union I have, which is Union of Taxation Employees, there's no dedicated position for youth as representatives. If you take a model of United Nations, there's a UN Youth Envoy, so which is also nominated by the big guys there. So it's like a dedicated representation from youth is needed whenever the decision making is done, and there should be some guidelines for it that can be criteria can be made so that youth feels involved in the union. So there's still a gap between youth and the union executives. It's not hard to be elected for sure. So there's also lack of social networking events within the unions itself. Unions are, I think that there's a lot to be done. I feel lack of energy, and social networking events, what BIPN committee asked me, that they want to feel involved, they want to know what work we do, and there should be direct conversations, that they just don't happen. And thirdly, there's a very interesting point what I'm going to mention, is diversity training. So because we are living in a multicultural environment, we are coming in touch with so many different people from so many different backgrounds and ethnicities. It becomes very important for us to have employees trained on diversity. We understand the concepts of respect, integrity, collaboration, professionalism. They are on paper, but diversity training is most important. There are some, for example, I'll give you an example. So there are some communities who like to meet with a handshake. There are some communities who might think to meet someone or greet someone with a kiss can be offensive. There are some communities which will just say hello like this. So there are different ways of treating diversity, greeting diversity, and this is the kind of training that we need to bring in, imbibe, so that people actually feel inclusive. And it's very doable. There are many advisors. I'm trying to get those sessions done in my area so that people are able to understand how to get how to get others feel inclusive. And at the last, youth need swag. You need more discount partnerships. There are not many that exist. And I see that energy diminishing when I go and present for YPN in my new hire presentations or student hire presentations. So they want swag, they want to feel involved, but there's nothing to feel proud and they are not able to wear anything. Like, you need to have those goodies, and I think this is something when you do collective agreements can put in, because you want to have youth empowered, but it's just not happening. So that can be a branding strategy for youth. So there are many challenges that diversities are going through. Even I was told I cannot speak English, so I was rejected a job in federal public service, and that took a few months ago. So I filed grievances too. But it's pathetic in the sense that there are so many things that we are doing as core values: respect, integrity, collaboration, professionalism, and all of a sudden all of your credentials just go down to zero. So, those things should not happen. But to prevent those things, you all need to have strong personalities. Otherwise, minorities can be degraded, they can be pushed aside. But to get inclusive environments, you all have to be strong personalities. You need to make sure what is right and wrong is wrong. So there's a difference between that. So that's the reason, one of the reasons that I started involving with the unions itself, so that those lobbyings can be done so that people feel inclusive, empowered, respected. Yeah. And so at the end, I think you all are awesome, and it's great to be here. You all can find out those platforms where conversations can be started, where communication channels can be devised newly. There can be many channels for innovation. And this is what I think, and this is what I have my perspectives like, and it's just so great to be here. Thank you so much.
So no, thank you all so much for having me here today. Apologies for being a little bit late. I thought it was at 10, and then here I am, and everyone's already speaking. I also figured that being a labor youth conference, I shouldn't dress up like Joel did. Because I walked into the AFL office yesterday wearing a three-piece suit, and just, let me tell you, felt really out of place. But no, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be able to speak about youth in governance and youth in politics, and labor youth in particular. And let me just tell you, when I get a call from PSAC, I'm just really glad that I didn't accidentally accept a meeting with the Petroleum Services Association of Canada, because that's happened to me before. But, so let me tell you a little bit about youth in governance and myself. I think, as you guys, and it was mentioned in that introduction, will know, most of my colleagues in the legislature are just a tad older than me. So I'm 23 right now, as of like last week, but I got elected when I was 20 years old and 28 days. So I might actually be one of the younger people in this room. It's certainly younger than Joel again. I'm just going to pick on Joel.
A lot younger.
But when my young colleagues and I had a few colleagues that are around the same age as me, Michael Connolly in Calgary, Deborah Jeever in Calgary, Estefania Cortes Vargas in Strathmore Shores Park. And when we were first elected, let me tell you, the pundits, they did not have high hopes for us. They looked at us young people and they said, who are these kids? And what are they trying to do changing policy? What are they doing going into a legislature and talking about governance? And who are these people and what right do they have to make a difference in our province, basically, is what they were trying to say. But let me tell you what I heard instead from not the pundits, but from average working Albertans that lived in my area, that lived across the city and the province, was that people were ecstatic. People were ecstatic because we finally had youth in politics. We had people who not only represented them, but reflected them. People who looked like them. I speak multiple languages, so I sounded like them. People who, when we were elected, we had an average age in the caucus of 42, which was the same as the average age in the province. We're the youngest province in the country. So we had this really diverse group of people like doctors, nurses, teachers, labor leaders, and social workers, and yeah, the 5 students of which I was the youngest. So when we saw this huge diversity in the caucus, it was exciting for governance, because we said, well, we can actually reflect what people in Alberta care about, because the young people were being really poorly represented when it was a bunch of old white guys in politics. Right? Like, when everybody, when the average age of the caucus is 65, you're not going to get anybody who understands how Instagram works. So, I mean, it's really cool that we have this government that is reflective of these different opinions. So, when people tell you, and people tell me this all the time, get a lot of unsolicited advice when you're a politician. When people tell you that you're too young to make a difference, or in my case, I'm too young to be an MLA, or too young to possibly know about issues or whatever it is, well, they're wrong. Being too young and not having the life experience, it's not measured in years. It's measured in what you do and how you live, and the issues that we're talking about as government are the issues for every single person in this room, right? The issues that we're talking about in government aren't for the 65-year-old white guys, because the changes we make on things like climate change, the changes we make on things like labor law, aren't going to affect them. It's going to affect us, the people in this room, right? So it's all about young people and their advocacy. So I got involved in politics when I was in high school, so a couple of years younger than I am right now. And how I got involved, I usually tell this to grade 6 kids, so I hope you like it. How I got involved was, if you remember in 2012, Premier Redford proposed a number of significant cuts to our education system in the province. And I was actually in high school at the time. And that was, well, really problematic for me. I liked my teachers. I was a bit of a nerd. I saw my classmates who needed the supports and needed things like educational assistance. And the big problem for me there was if you do all these cuts to education and you don't build any new schools and you don't invest in our communities, well, that's going to be a huge problem because we're just not going to have an educated workforce moving into the future. We're not going to have educated Albertans that know how to make good decisions and do things like critical thinking or know that Donald Trump is a bad guy, right? Like, you're just not going to have those Albertans. So I was involved in the 2012, there was a student walkout to protest those education cuts in like June or something. And I was one of the speakers at that walkout. And there I met some guy, his name was David Eggen. And I was basically talking with him on the stage, at the side of the stage there, and it was like, and he walked up to me and said, hey, we should grab a coffee, we should chat. And I said, oh, that'd be really cool, let's do that. Turns out David Eggen was the MLA for Edmonton Calder at the time. One person in a four-person opposition of the third party, you know, fourth party at the time, I think, actually. So here we are now. Basically, long story short, I started volunteering with Dave. I got more and more involved in the party. I talked to him about issues I cared about. He was education critic at the time, I believe. We talked about things like investing in healthcare and public services and making sure that we had meaningful youth engagement in governance. And then when 2015 came around, they're like, hey, we need someone to run in Southwest. I said, sure, I'll do that. Sounds like it could be a fun experience. And then here we are. But what I didn't know at the time was that when I was involved in that protest, when I was involved in that rally with students, is that all that experience I got with advocacy and with the youth movement and with advocating for education issues, that's all things that I had to use later as an MLA. And I can speak especially to that because in my area, in Southwest Edmonton, I'm in Edmonton Southwest, lots and lots of growth, lots and lots of young families. So people our age, more or less, lots of people who are having their first child, maybe 2 or 3 years old, and buying their first home. And it means that in my area, for example, we need a lot of new schools. So when I get to speak about my experience in education and caring about education issues, it connects with a lot of people. I mean, I go out there and I door knock almost every week, and you hear people and they say, "Oh, it's really great you got a high school built because my kid in a couple of years is going to need a high school." And I mean, those are the type of issues that people care about, right? It's the issues that it's not these big ideas that are aspirational goals from 20 years from now. It's the people care about issues that affect their lives, right? So in this room, you guys all obviously care about your labor issues. You care about the things that PSAC stands for, and I mean that's exciting, right? Because people want to make a difference in their lives right now. Okay, so somebody help me write the speech, and it's just really long, so I'm gonna flip a bunch of pages over. You know, I'm like there's a bunch of things they want me to touch on, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the things the government's doing. I think, and one of the things I'm really proud about, I helped work on a little bit was advanced education. So one of the really coolest things we did in advanced education was we froze tuition for the last 2.5 years now. And I mean, that saves the average Albertan who's going to school maybe over those 2.5 years almost $1,000, right? And I went to university. I took a computing science degree, I went to computing science, and we'll get the degree eventually. I have to do this thing instead for a while. But no, I mean, it was really tough for a long time in this province, right? Like tuition would go up, and I'm sure a lot of you all know that. Mandatory non-instructional fees would go up, and you didn't really know what they were going for. We had like a hallway fee you had to pay for a while, and I think you were paying to walk down the hallway. So we had all these things, and I mean, the reason I'm bringing this up with advanced education is I think a lot of people in this room can probably relate to having to pay exorbitant fees, maybe still paying down student debt. I think Joel just paid off his student loans.
I'm still paying.
Still paying student loans right there. So I think, and Joel's a lot older than me, so.
An old guy like me.
I pay 3 times the more.
Still, he's gonna pay 3. He's gonna pay until he's like 60, guys. Come on. But no, I think when we're talking about issues that actually affect Albertans and affect young workers and young people, having young people involved in the legislative process, having young people involved in the party process, and talking about the issues that matter to us, like having meaningful access to post-secondary education, having access that isn't just massive loans that will last forever, but things like grant programs, right? Having those types of discussions. Nobody who doesn't represent us, so nobody who's a 65-year-old white guy is going to talk about post-secondary granting, because they're like, well, why doesn't the young person want a tax break in 15 years? Well, give them a tax credit for their tuition. It's like, well, because a tax credit, they can't claim it because they're not going to be making any money while they're a student, right? Like, even if they're working 2-3 jobs as a student, the tax credit's helping them very little, right? So when we talk about the issues that young people care about, it's really important that we're actually at the table, because if we're not, they just don't understand. Because a 65-year-old white guy who's at the end of his career is like, tax break would be great. I'd love a tax break. I paid less in April or whatever, right? I get a return, right? They love that stuff, but it doesn't help us when we're young and we're dealing with things like precarious work and working a minimum wage job, which I did, right? Like, it doesn't help young people. So I think the point being that getting involved as a young person isn't a lost cause, because getting involved as a young person is how we actually make our mark. It's how we actually make changes that affect the future, right? Change the future for our future generation. I mean, other things that are important in that scope, I think the government's done a big investment into student mental health and mental health in general in this province. But when we talk about those issues, people who don't represent us just don't understand that student mental health is a big issue, right? So I think we can talk about all these issues. We can talk about all these things like the government's investment in childcare or public transit. I mean, yesterday I was with Minister Mason announcing some new electric buses for the city of Edmonton, and we talk about these issues because transit in the city is important, right? Government investing in transit is important because young people take the bus everywhere or take the LRT everywhere. And when we do that, we still want to be conscious of our environment, so investing in things like electric buses is super important. I think when we talk about these issues, it's important that young people are at the table, because it's always that extra step that young people have the thought for, right? You can invest in LRT, you can invest in buses, but having that extra step and saying, hey, wait, I want to invest in buses, but I want to be environmentally conscious about my buses beyond just mass transit's good. I want to think about having an electric bus. I want to think about having, what type of, even if we have an electric bus, what's my grid made out of, right? Are we just powering it with coal, or are we using renewables, right? So I think those types of discussions are things that young people can bring to the table. I don't need to tell you guys about minimum wage. You guys, I'm sure you guys all know about the minimum wage legislation or regulations. Yeah, I mean, lots of labor changes coming around. But I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about making a point that as a young person, you need to go out there, because nobody's going to ask, well, I'm asking you, but nobody other than me is going to ask you to be involved. Nobody's going to ask you to join a political party. Nobody's going to ask you to run for office. Nobody's going to ask you to make a difference in your community, because they don't think that young people's voices are loud enough. They don't think that young people's voices really matter that much, and they're wrong. We matter. The issues we care about matter, and we need to go out and tell people that. We saw it happen to some extent in the States. We saw it happen in the last provincial election here, in the last federal election, that there was a lot of energy from youth, and we can continue to see that happen as long as every single person in this room goes out and says, I really care about my community, I care about the issues that affect my community, I care about the issues that affect my union, and fight for them. Because the labor movement and the NDP obviously being a party that comes from the labor movement, we've had to fight for every single step, especially here in Alberta. If you know anything about Alberta, so we had 44 years of Conservatives, and we had to fight for every single step of every single change we got made. When we did things like update the labor legislation here in Alberta, let me tell you, I had every single corporate lobbyist knocking on my door, trying to get me to change our mind on even the relatively small changes we made. Right? It's not easy to make change, but young people can do it, because we are going to be the largest voting bloc in the next few years. We will easily be the largest voting bloc. The future is for us, so we should actually act on being that voting bloc.